All right, let's keep reading Revelation 17. We're going to read verses 15 through 18 at this point in time. So let's pick up. Remember, the angel is giving John the interpretation of the vision. So it says, and he said to me, right, the angel, the waters. Remember, he's describing the woman and the beast that the woman's riding. The angel, started by describing the beast and the 10 kings. But now he's going to jump down to the waters and then finally give us a look at the beast himself, the woman herself. The waters which you saw, where the prostitute sits, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. We're going to unpack that in a little bit. Verse 16, and the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the prostitute. We're in verse 16. They're going to hate the prostitute and they will make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire, right? They don't like her for some reason. I have my speculations, but it doesn't say why here, but I have my suspicions. But let's continue reading 2 more verses. Verse 17, for God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. This could represent the part of the destruction of Mystery Babylon itself that we're going to later read about in chapter 18 of Revelation, where, Babylon, oh, Babylon the Great, how you have fallen, blah, 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 where it's borrowing all this language from both ancient Babylon of the Tanakh period, as well as borrowing language from ancient Jerusalem, who is the ancient harlot in the Bible as well, right? Both of those are kind of overlapping themes that make Mystery Babylon a good candidate for being eschatological Jerusalem. So let's read the final verse in chapter 17, which has John saying, the woman, right? I find this interesting. He tells the angel, he tells John very earlier on, let me tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that she's riding. And then he spends all this time talking about the beast. And then in one verse, he says, and the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Done. I'm like, come on. If I were John, I would have demanded a refund on that movie, because come on, angel, you gave me all these details about the beast and the waters and the 10 horns. But what's up with the woman? One verse, she's the great city that reigns over the kings. And that's it. So it's almost like we're meant to focus more on the beast than the woman. So, take it for what it's worth. Let's look at my notes here. So there it is. That's about all I can say. The angel explicitly says the woman is a great city. And what more can we say? So much for Mystery Babylon being just a system. Right? I've heard people say that Mystery Babylon is a system, but that's not what the angel says. It's a city. It's a specific city. And as we'll see, according to Chris White's thesis, it's Jerusalem, eschatological Jerusalem, end times Jerusalem. If you look at Jerusalem today, she doesn't fit the bill. She needs to be much more important and much wealthier than she is right now in order to fit the bill for Mystery Babylon. Also, she needs to be more prominent when it comes to seafaring trade. Mystery Babylon is described as a kind of a port city, which Jerusalem is not on the coast, like Tyre or something like that, or even the Gaza Strip. Jerusalem is inland, right? I think it's 30 miles, something like that. But even if we said that even if we look at the candidate as Rome, being Mystery Babylon, we also have to remember that Rome is also inland. And I think it's even farther inland than Jerusalem. Mecca, likewise, is inland, right? It's not on the coast. How about ancient Babylon itself? It's on the river's bank, right? It's on the bank of the river there, but it's not on the bank. It's not on the coast of the Persian Gulf itself. It's several hundred miles inland. So in these candidates for who's Mystery Babylon, and we start looking at details about it being a port city or something that can be seen, that the smoke can rise and be seen from the ships that are on the sea, like we're going to read about in the next chapter of Revelation, chapter 18, when it's being destroyed. It would appear that perhaps out of all the candidates, Mecca, Rome, Jerusalem, Vatican City, or something like that, New York City, all of these candidates, perhaps maybe only New York City is the one that's truly right on the water's edge there. Manhattan is right there on the edge. But the other cities are inland to a degree that we'd have to see the smoke rising. But as we're going to see later on, I'm kind of tipping my cards early. If Jerusalem were set on fire, you could see the smoke easily from the Mediterranean Sea, from the coast, right? I heard that when 9/11 happened and the Twin Towers were burning, the smoke could be seen for hundreds of miles. So it doesn't seem to be a far stretch. Okay, so let's go into part 2. The beast that was, is not, and will come. Let's talk about this. All right. The first part of the angel's interpretation is about the beast. As I mentioned earlier, this is kind of interesting that he goes there first. The angel says, the beast was, is not, and will come up out of the abyss. What does this mean? Now, Chris White, the author of the book that we're borrowing our notes from, he explains that this is describing the Antichrist's counterfeit resurrection. So we've got Revelation 13:3 again that we looked at. I'll flash it on the screen for you so you don't have to look it up on your own. It says, quote, and we didn't look at this directly, but going backwards into the book from Revelation 17 where we're at, we can borrow the notes there so we can begin to form the context of what John means by the beast that you saw that was and is not and comes up out of the abyss. In verse 3 of chapter 13, where we're first introduced to the beast, John writes, I saw one of its heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast, end quote. This is where we see that the seemingly, what I would say, cause and effect relationship or connection, correlation between the amazement of the earth and wondering and the following after the beast is directly connected to his resurrection, whether it be real, faked, or appeared to be resurrected. We don't know. I'm of the impression that he really will die and resurrect. It is a man, in my opinion. It's not just a system, it's not just a resurrected empire, like a revived Roman Empire or something to that effect. Although I think that plays into it. However, when we're talking about a resurrection, I think we're really talking about a man. So could we say that a man resurrects? Yes. Could we say that an empire resurrects? Yes. Again, both of them seem to work. I'm of the impression that both probably will. All right. So either way, looking just at Revelation 13:3, we could make this conclusion. We could say that this means that the Antichrist will appear to die, then come back to life in a satanic parody of Christ's death and resurrection. As I mentioned earlier, the Antichrist is going to find it necessary to either declare himself as Jesus, or declare himself as the Messiah, or declare himself in opposition to Messiah. Something to that effect. His name Antichrist carries those overlapping themes of against Christ, in place of Christ, opposed to Christ. But either way, a faked or an imitated death and resurrection would seem to do the trick, especially if he's trying to fool Christians, because Christians already know that Jesus died and resurrected, or at least it was spoken about that he died and resurrected. Remember, a lot of people read the Bible and don't believe everything to be factual. They just believe maybe that a lot of it was made up by Christians. So how that's going to factor in, genuine Christians know that Jesus did die and resurrected once already. So if Antichrist hits the scene and says, hey, guess what, everybody, I'm Jesus, come back from heaven to set up my kingdom, but then he gets shot in the head, dies, and then resurrects again, Christians should immediately spot the problem here. The Bible doesn't talk about Jesus dying twice and resurrecting twice, right? Remember, it says once and for all, right? I've read the book of Hebrews, did a study on it. Go to my website and read it. So having Jesus die twice and resurrect twice is a big red flag for genuine Christians. But for people in the world who don't quite follow the Bible closely, namely nominal Christians and maybe some religious Jews who kind of loosely followed their Jewish religion, having their Messiah die and rise from the dead again might be something that they say, well, yeah, okay, we're on board with that. Either way, what I go on to say is that the world will marvel, the lost will worship him. Now, notice the deception I say in my notes. Jesus is the one who was and is to come. Revelation 1:8. The beast mimics this by being the one who was, is not, and will come. It's a satanic counterfeit, right? Satan needs to have a kind of a list of career highlights that imitate the true Messiah. And one of these days I'll show you a list that Chris White put together. It's like about 10 different things or so. And it is scary the way that Antichrist is going to be able to possibly pull this off. But either way, when we talk about this concept of Antichrist being the one who's going to not just seek to deceive the world or seek to deceive Jews, but also seek to deceive Christians with his death and resurrection, which, again, could be God allowing him to be resurrected because God is going to send the strong delusion on those who refused to embrace the truth. That's Paul's words in 2 Thessalonians all over again. Either way, what I say in my notes is that this helps us understand why the nations follow him so willingly. They believe he has conquered death, and this sets the stage for his enthronement in Jerusalem's temple at the midpoint of the week. Let's keep going. We're making progress. Part 3, the 7 heads. Remember, the angel didn't answer the question in the order of the vision that John saw. He described it as woman, then beast, then the heads and things like that, in that order. But then when the angel unpacks the vision, he starts with the beast and the 7 heads and things like that. Then he talks about the woman very end. So let's talk a little bit about the 7 heads as kings, not hills, but kings. Now we come to one of the most debated verses in Revelation, which is verse 9. I've reproduced it here in my study here for you, so you don't have to look it up. It reads again, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. All right. I know what you're saying. All right. Many interpreters say, aha, there we go. 7 hills. That's Rome. There we go. Case closed, right? Everyone thinks it's Rome because it says 7 hills. Not so fast. Let's look closely. The angel says the heads are not just mountains, they're kings. All right? Specifically, look at my bullet points on the screen. 5 have fallen. 1 is. 1 has not yet come. And the 4th bullet point, the beast himself is an 8th, but belongs to the 7. So that's the breakdown of what the angel tells us. The heads are not just mountains. Yes, we can't erase that detail. He says they're mountains, but he says they're kings. This is clearly talking about kings, right? When we look at those 4 bullet points there, the 5 have fallen. 1 is yet has not yet come, and the beast himself is an 8th. This is clearly talking about kings and kingdoms, not geography, right? Chris White, in his book, the one that we're borrowing our notes from, he points out that if the heads were literal hills, then how could one of them die and come back to life? Okay, think about it. Use your brain. You can't kill and resurrect a hill, but you can kill and resurrect a king, the Antichrist, right? He's got a mortal head wound. How could you do that to a hill? And he goes on to say in his book, because I've read it, if it were a hill, why would the people of the world worship a resurrected hill? A hill that was not, at the time when John wrote, 5 hills. I mean, let's go back and read this for a second as if it's hills, all right? Let me go back and show you the verse again. All right, the verse reads, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. They are 7. Okay, no, I'm sorry. Where's the verse I want? I want the verse. Okay, I guess my bullet points works here. Let's just look at my bullet points. 5 have fallen, 1 is not yet come. The beast himself is an 8th, but belongs to the 7. Okay, let's pretend these are hills, okay? 5 hills have fallen. 1 hill has not yet come. And the beast himself is an 8th hill, but belongs to the 7 hills. Does that make any sense at all? I hope it doesn't. All right, let's keep going. So, Rome, I think, is ruled out by the angel's own interpretation. Rome, being Mystery Babylon, is ruled out. The focus is not on geography, but on rulers, on the unfolding of satanic kingdoms through history, culminating in the final Antichrist. So we're talking about the possibility of Rome being, again, I got to be careful here. I'm not saying that a revived Roman Empire couldn't be the system or the empire that comes back in the end times that Antichrist rules over. But when we're talking about someone receiving a mortal wound to the head that dies and then is resurrected, Rome is ruled out. That's what I mean, okay? The focus is not on geography that receives a mortal wound. The focus is on rulers and the unfolding of the satanic kingdoms throughout history, culminating in the final Antichrist, of which we know that Rome was one of those satanic kingdoms that was used and could likely be reused in the future. In fact, I think if you follow Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 and chapter 8 and chapter 9 and 10 and 11 and 12, follow those and then use that to form the important, crucial backdrop to reading John's words here, which are clearly hearkening back to the Danielic passages I just mentioned, then it becomes apparent to me that Rome should play a very important part. She already did in the past, right, in Daniel chapter 2. And then when we get to chapter 7 with the beasts that Daniel sees, it seems to also tie into some form of revived empire that lived in the past. Again, we'll talk more about this later. Right now, we're just kind of touching on most of the highlights. But I go on to say that, speaking of the death of this person and his resurrection, this is why Chris White insists that we need to let Scripture interpret Scripture. The angel's giving us the meaning. We don't need to force in Rome or any other city when it comes to the revival of the person from the dead. Although, again, could it be some form of empire that we could call Rome? Yeah, but we don't need to limit it there. In many ways, we could say that it will be simply a, when I say it, I'm talking about the 7th beast empire and the 8th one. It doesn't have to be a revived Roman Empire, but it seems to need to be able to control the Mediterranean area, which would include today most of Europe, East, what we would today call Turkey, but Eastern Asia back in the time, Asia Minor, but today would be Turkey. Most of what we call the Middle East now, which would include, Syria and Israel and Egypt. And then now we can keep drawing the picture. I'll put a map in the post-production so you can see this. As we're drawing out the map of the nations that surround the Mediterranean Sea, going down and going back towards the west again, we've got Egypt, and now we're in Upper Africa with I think Libya's over there, and Niger, and some of those other. If I'm just doing from memory, but you're looking at it in the YouTube land. But you get my point. Is ancient Rome was able to control much of that area in the past. In fact, I think she's the only one that did have most, if not all, of that area under her rule. Even the Islamic Caliphate didn't go as far west as, say, modern-day Europe today. but other nations exerted some control in certain places closer to the Middle East, namely Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. But when we got to Rome, we got a lot of geographical coverage. And then even if we want to bring in the Islamic, the Islamic powers, the Caliphate, the Turkish Empire, we can still see that even though they controlled much of that area, still wasn't as much as Rome. But my point is that we're talking about the death of this person and the resurrection of this person. And that's why I say that we don't need to start speculating about it being a Rome. We don't even have to call it Rome when it comes to the empires. We could just say it's a seventh beast empire that rises to power at the end of days, that likely includes a lot of the geography today that we recognize today as Europe and Turkey and the Middle East and Iraq and Iran and Jordan and Egypt and Upper Africa and things like that. That's kind of what we're talking about when I say seventh beast empire, which the seventh ruler gets shot and resurrects and he becomes the eighth, but his empire itself is largely the same. Let's keep going. Part 4, we're winding down. We got about 10 minutes left in the study. Part 4, the 10 horns and the final alliance, which is kind of why I spent a little bit more time to set up this particular discussion. Next, I talk about how that the angel explains the 10 horns. And this is kind of where it's getting a little bit more political and military. And that's why I kind of spent a little bit more time transitioning from what we were talking about earlier with the woman and the reading the Bible passages. Now we're kind of getting more into just military and politics. These are 10 kings who haven't yet received a kingdom, but will receive authority for 1 hour with the beast. How is that going to play out? Hard to say. Perhaps they will have some power on paper. Perhaps they'll have some delegated power, but weakened form of it. Either way, this shows us that the Antichrist doesn't rise alone. He has allies, right? I imagine that when he's having his war room discussions, I'll put like a little graphic in post-production of a military leader sitting in the middle of a table with 5 people on either side of him representing the 10 nations, and they're all like in military uniform. When he's having his wartime scenario games where he's talking about how he's slicing and dicing the world and controlling everything, he's not alone. He has allies. For a brief time, symbolized as 1 hour, these 10 rulers give him their power. So again, he's not unchallenged. If we read through the book of Daniel and even parts of Ezekiel, we're going to have to talk about how this all fits together. These 10 kings, what do they do with that power? Verse 14 tells us, it says they wage war against the Lamb. So what we know is that eventually this military machine that the Antichrist and these 10 kings put together, they do it for the purpose of striking out against the Lamb. Now this is interesting. If the Antichrist has declared himself to be God at the midpoint, he somehow is already aware that Jesus is truly going to return to Jerusalem to claim his rightful ownership over, and then kind of put the mystery Babylon aspect of Jerusalem down so that the true righteous Jerusalem can be resurrected of sorts. I know that we're going to have to work through this later because this is a major objection for those who say, Ariel, how can you and Chris White be right that Mystery Babylon is eschatological Jerusalem when Mystery Babylon is spoken of as being destroyed and never rising again, and yet Jerusalem will be reestablished? How can you say it's Jerusalem? Okay, I don't want to tip my cards right now, but there's a way to work through some of that. But suffice to say, somehow the Antichrist knows that Jesus is going to be returning to Jerusalem. So in Revelation chapter, I think it's around 15 or 16, he begins to muster his troops together and gather them into the Middle East where he can anticipate that Jesus is going to show up. And that's where he's going to do battle with them at the Battle of Armageddon. Because when Jesus returns on the white horse in Revelation 19, the Antichrist is there waiting for him with all of his troops. So this means that they must have known in advance that Jesus was going to return to Jerusalem. They wage war against the Lamb. So this points us, Isaiah, in my notes, directly to Armageddon, where the nations unite against Christ at his return. But the point is, have you ever noticed that they know in advance that Jesus is going to show up there? Somehow they know. They've been reading the prophecies. They know that Jerusalem is the place. Or could it be that Jesus already returned earlier, the rapture took place earlier, and that Jesus, instead of just going back up to heaven and staying there, he's actually been on planet Earth, going here and there, reaching out, ministering to Israelites who've been hiding out in the desert, in the southern desert, for 3.5 years. They fled from Antichrist. They've been hiding out, and Jesus is now down there pleading with them face to face to accept him and embrace him. And he's going to be leading this procession, this greater exodus from the south back up north towards Jerusalem, towards the seat of Antichrist power, with the goal of unseating the Antichrist, defeating him once and for all, and establishing Jerusalem as his father's as the throne that his father has given him. Could that be what's going to be happening? And so that's why the Antichrist, aware of this figure who's already on earth, declaring himself to be Jesus, who's ministering to Jews and leading many of them into a genuine salvation experience, is marching towards Jerusalem. And therefore the Antichrist musters his armies and says, I'm going to meet you, right? Come on, bring it on. Come on, let's do battle. But somehow Jesus ends up in the sky on a horse and comes down from heaven. So I guess he has to go from earth back up to heaven, grab us, the saints, grab a bunch of angels, we all get on horses, and then we come down and we do battle to Battle of Armageddon or something like that. All right, we'll figure it out. In my notes, I say the angel gives us hope. Even though there is going to be a battle, we already know that the Lamb will overcome them. Why? Because he's Lord of Lords and King of Kings. So even in the darkest alliance of evil in history, Antichrist, who's Satan incarnate basically, 10 kings who have aligned with him, even in this dark hour, Christ remains sovereign. He allows it to happen until the words of God are fulfilled. Nothing is out of his control. It will get very dark. Remember, this is the time period, the tribulation that took place earlier. This is the time period which Christians will be losing their lives in mass. This is the time period when God's wrath will also be poured out on planet Earth. By the time we get to Armageddon, the earth will be practically, utterly in ruin, almost useless. But God allows these things to happen because God's in control. Nothing is out of his control. Let's go on to part 5. The beast turns on the woman, right? We're winding down our study. Finally, in verse 16 through 18, which we read tonight of Revelation chapter 17, we see the description of the shocking twist. The beast and the 10 kings will hate the harlot, which we're going to say is eschatological Jerusalem. They're going to strip her, devour her, and burn her with fire. So no matter who you say Mystery Babylon will be, Rome, Mecca, New York City, Jerusalem, Vatican City, or whoever you think it is, Salt Lake City, I don't know, San Francisco, whoever it is, the Antichrist and the 10 kings are going to turn on her. For whatever reason, they feel that she's used up her purpose. I think part of it has to do with the fact that she will be the seat not just of political power for Antichrist, but remember, he turned her into a religious power. Earlier than the midpoint in the first part, I think that he endorsed Judaism and allowed her to occupy a place as the world religion, tricking them into thinking that this is the Messianic age. I think that's likely a scenario that could go that direction. So for the first 3.5 years, Jerusalem was the undisputed religious capital of the world with the endorsement of the most powerful man in the world, Antichrist, at the time. And thus, they became very, very wealthy, according to Revelation chapter 17 and 18, the wealth with all the gold and stuff that she has. Right? Remember, she has to rebuild the temple, and that's a lot of gold there. One of the wonders of the world will be returning with the temple in Jerusalem. However, by the midpoint of the week and moving into the second half of Antichrist's career, the second half of the 70th week of Daniel, he doesn't seem to need the religious Jewish component anymore. He kind of takes over, kicks the Jews out, so to say, or subjugates them. Islam at this point in time, I think, has already been subjugated or destroyed or amalgamated into that fake version of Judaism, whatever that was in the first half. Whatever version of religion that was, call it what you will. It wasn't any true religion, but it was something that served the Antichrist's purpose to gain him wealth and power and prestige and the world's admiration. And then he gets shot, and then he comes back to life, and then he declares himself to God at the middle point of the week, and then he starts to begin to turn on Jerusalem, I think, at that point in time. He's like, I don't really need you anymore. I'm going to worship a God of fortresses, like it says in the book of Daniel. I think around chapter 11. He worships the God of fortresses. He doesn't, which is really Satan. He doesn't worship the God of his ancestors. In fact, it says in Daniel as well that he will not worship the God of his fathers, which I think gives him a claim to Jewish lineage myself. But point being is, at some point in time, politically and militarily speaking, he doesn't need this religion. He doesn't need it. And so he's like, nope, I'm done with you. So he and the 10 kings, they turn on her, they burn her. And let me continue now. This means the Antichrist will betray the very city that enthroned him. Right? You ever thought about that? Think about this. For a time, Jerusalem will sit as queen, drunk with power, leading the nations in worship of the Antichrist. That's that false religion that kind of occupies prominently more of the first half of the week. Will it look like a Jewish religion? Yeah. Will it look like maybe a mix between Islam and Judaism? Could be. Like I said, Islam at that point in time will either be subjugated, destroyed, or mixed into Judaism, like maybe just one giant Abrahamic faith. Maybe even Islam, Judaism, and Christianity will all be kind of mixed up together into some form of syncretistic religion that serves the purpose of the Antichrist, and that Israel will be blind to this reality. I don't know what Muslims around the world will be doing, but Christians will probably be fooled. But, the Muslims are already fooled at this point right now, right? Currently, they're fooled. But the point being is that this end-time Jerusalem will be very rich because of all the merchants pouring their gold and wares into this city, whoever she turns out to be, which I think will be Jerusalem, leading to the nations worshiping the Antichrist. But then we know at the midpoint, the beast himself, at the midpoint, he will declare himself to be God. And then some time after that, the beast himself will turn against her and destroy her. Why will he do that? Because Satan never shares glory. He uses Jerusalem, then he discards her. And yet, I go on to say, verse 17 says, it is ultimately God's plan. God uses the beast's hatred to accomplish his judgment. The destruction of the harlot city is part of God's righteous decree. Let's draw our study to a close. Let me give you what I'm going to call a closing application and a preview of week 4. All right, this shouldn't take but 5 minutes. So, what have we learned tonight? Mystery Babylon is a great city, not just a system and not just a symbol. She's a city, right? No matter who you say she's going to be, she will, in fact, be a city. Rome, New York, Mecca, Vatican City, something like that. She's still a city. Point number 2, the beast is the Antichrist, mimicking Christ with a counterfeit resurrection. I believe he will be a man that is shot in the head or something to that effect. That talks about a head wound. Or a fatal wound. I don't know if it's a head wound, but some type of wound that appears to be fatal. And then there's a counterfeit resurrection. Or when I say counterfeit here, I don't mean that it won't be genuine. I mean that it will be, from Messiah's perspective, counterfeit, meaning since he's a counterfeit Messiah, his resurrection will be known to be counterfeit because Jesus only died once and only resurrected once. Thus, whatever the Antichrist goes through, which I believe will be a real death and resurrection, in the end, it's still a deception. That's what I mean by counterfeit. Point number 3, what we learned tonight is that the 7 heads are kings. They're not hills, so Rome is ruled out in terms of the city. In terms of the person being Rome. In other words, don't confuse the city with the system that could be the beast system itself. Could the beast system be what we might recognize as a revived Rome? Kind of, yeah, we could go in that direction. But when we're talking about who receives the wound, who is resurrected, think person, don't think city. That's what I mean by Rome is ruled out there. All right. What we also learned tonight is that the 10 horns are 10 kings. This goes all the way back to Daniel. The 10 horns are 10 kings who briefly ally with the beast against Christ. And the last bullet point is that the beast ultimately turns on the harlot city, fulfilling God's judgment. And what I notice is that all of this points consistently towards Jerusalem in the last days, a city that allies with the Antichrist, exalts him, and is then destroyed by him. Either way, even if I'm wrong, even if it's not Jerusalem, the other details are unmistakable. This city, whoever she turns out to be, she allies with the Antichrist, she exalts him, and then she's destroyed by him. So, next week in chapter 3, what we're going to do is we're going to look more closely at the relationship between the woman and the beast, and how Jerusalem, I believe, functions as a false high priest, and at the details of her betrayal. But until then, I want you to reflect on this. I'm speaking to Christians now. Are we so focused on outward appearances, wealth, power, religious trappings, that we risk missing obedience to God's word? Because the harlot looked like a priest, but she was lawless. Don't be that way. If you're a believer and you look like a believer on the outside, then act that way on the inside, right? Don't chase after wealth. Don't chase after power or religious trappings. Seek after God. Seek first the kingdom of God. Seek his face. Seek his spirit. Those are the things that matter. Okay? All right. I just want to say thank you for joining me tonight. Stay grounded in the word. Keep your eyes on Yeshua. And remember, no matter how hard it gets, the Lamb will overcome. Amen? Amen. That'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.